The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty town square of Cedar Ridge, Arizona. Sarah Winters stepped out of her pickup truck, her weathered boots hitting the ground with purpose. At 62, she carried herself with the quiet dignity that came from surviving decades of hardship and discrimination. Her long black hair, now streaked with silver, was pulled back in a simple braid that hung down her back. She had driven 3 hours from the San Carlos Apache reservation to attend this estate auction. The newspaper clipping in her jacket pocket had caught her attention 2 weeks ago. Historic Riverside Ranch estate auction, items dating back to 1880s. The accompanying photograph showed furniture, household items, and what appeared to be Native American artifacts spread across tables under white tents. Sarah wasn't here as a collector or curiosity seeker. She had a specific purpose, one that had kept her awake at night since seeing that newspaper clipping. Her grandmother's stories echoed in her mind as she walked toward the crowd gathering around the auction tables. Stories of loss of family members who had simply vanished, of children taken and never seen again. The Riverside Ranch had belonged to the Mackenzie family for over a century. Everyone in the area knew the name. They had been cattle ranchers, land developers, and prominent members of the community. What most people didn't know was the darker history that Sarah's family had passed down through oral tradition. As she approached the auction site, Sarah noticed a man in his 50s standing near one of the display tables. His sun-weathered face and calloused hands marked him as someone who worked outdoors. His brown hair was graying at the temples, and he wore the standard uniform of ranch work: worn jeans, boots, and a button-down shirt with rolled-up sleeves. This had to be Tom Mackenzie, the current owner who was selling off the family estate after his father's recent death. Sarah had researched the Mackenzie family thoroughly before making this trip. Tom had inherited the ranch but couldn't afford to maintain it. Medical bills from his father's long illness had drained the family's resources, forcing him to sell the property and liquidate everything inside the old ranch house. By all accounts, Tom was a decent man who had struggled to keep his family's legacy alive while dealing with financial hardship. But Sarah knew things about the Mackenzie family that Tom likely had never heard. Stories that had been carefully hidden, buried beneath decades of respectability and community standing. Her great-great-grandmother had worked on the original Riverside Ranch in the 1880s, not as an employee, but as something else entirely. The auction was already underway when Sarah found a spot near the back of the crowd. She watched as household items were sold off one by one: china sets, furniture, farm equipment, books, and clothing. The auctioneer's rapid-fire voice created a rhythm that seemed to hypnotize the bidders. People raised their hands for antique chairs, old photographs, and kitchen items that would find new homes and houses across the state. Sarah wasn't interested in any of these items. She was waiting for something specific, something she hoped would be included in the sale. According to her grandmother's stories, there should be documentation somewhere in the Mackenzie house. Papers that would prove what had really happened to Apache families in this area during the late 1800s. As the morning progressed, the items being auctioned became more personal. Family photographs, letters, and documents that represented the Mackenzie family's history. Sarah watched Tom's face as strangers bid on his family's memories. She could see the pain in his eyes as items that had belonged to his grandparents and great-grandparents were sold to the highest bidder. When the auctioneer announced a break for lunch, Sarah saw her opportunity. She approached Tom, who was standing alone near his truck drinking coffee from a thermos and looking exhausted. "Mr. Mackenzie?" she said quietly. Tom looked up, surprised to be approached by someone he didn't recognize. "Yes, that's me. Are you here for the auction?" "In a way," Sarah replied. "My name is Sarah Winters. I'm from the San Carlos reservation. I was wondering if I could speak with you privately for a few minutes." Tom's expression became cautious. In his experience, conversations that began this way usually meant trouble. "What about?" "About your family's history, about things that happened on your ranch a long time ago. Look, if this is about land disputes or something legal, you should probably talk to my lawyer. I'm just trying to get through this auction and settle my father's debts." Sarah shook her head. "It's not about money or land. It's about people. Apache people who lived and worked on your ranch more than 100 years ago." Tom studied her face, trying to read her intentions. "I don't know much about the early history of the ranch. My father wasn't much for talking about the old days, and his father died when I was just a kid." "That's what I was afraid of," Sarah said softly. Mr. Mackenzie, there are things about your family's past that you should know. Things that were kept hidden for good reason, but things that affected real people. Apache families who never got to tell their side of the story. The lunch break was nearly over, and people were beginning to gather around the auction tables again. Tom glanced at the crowd, then back at Sarah. Something in her manner, the quiet intensity in her voice, made him curious despite his wariness. "What kind of things?" he asked. "The kind of things that leave scars," Sarah replied. "Physical scars and emotional ones that get passed down through generations." Tom was quiet for a long moment, watching the auctioneer prepare for the afternoon session. Finally, he spoke. "After the auction ends today, if you want to talk, I'll be here packing up whatever doesn't sell. But I can't promise I'll know anything about what you're talking about." Sarah nodded. "Thank you. I think you'll be surprised by what you learn." As the afternoon auction session began, Sarah remained at the back of the crowd, watching and waiting. She knew that somewhere in the remaining items being sold, there might be evidence of what had really happened on the Riverside Ranch. Documents, photographs, or personal items that would support the stories her grandmother had told her. But more than that, she hoped that Tom Mackenzie would be willing to listen to the truth about his family's legacy, the truth about the Apache families who had lived on his land, not as willing workers but as something much more tragic. The truth about children who had been taken from their families, about women who had been bought and sold like property, about men who had been forced to work without pay. The afternoon sun was getting lower in the sky, and the auction was winding down. Soon, Sarah would have her chance to tell Tom Mackenzie about the scars that his family had left on hers, scars that looked like ink marks on old documents, but represented something much more painful than simple record-keeping. The time had come to reveal the truth about what had really happened at the Riverside Ranch, and Sarah hoped that Tom would have the courage to face it. The auction ended just as the sun began its descent behind the desert mountains. Most of the bidders had loaded their purchases and driven away, leaving behind empty tables and scattered pieces of paper blowing in the evening breeze. Tom Mackenzie stood among the remaining unsold items, making notes on a clipboard and looking more tired than when the day had started. Sarah approached him slowly, giving him time to notice her coming. She had spent the afternoon thinking about how to begin this conversation, how to tell a man that everything he believed about his family's honor and respectability was built on a foundation of terrible secrets. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said when she was close enough to speak without raising her voice. Tom looked up from his clipboard. The stress of the day showed in the lines around his eyes, but his expression was patient. "Ms. Winters, right? You said you wanted to talk about my family's history." "Yes, is there somewhere we could sit down? This might take a while." Tom gestured toward two folding chairs that had been set up near his truck. "Will this work? I have to admit, I'm curious about what you think you know about my family. We've been in this area for 4 generations, and I thought I knew our story pretty well." As they settled into the chairs, Sarah pulled a worn manila envelope from her jacket. "Before I begin, I want you to know that I'm not here to cause trouble, or to blame you for things that happened before you were born. But there are stories in my family about your ranch, about your great-great-grandfather, that I think you should hear." Tom leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Okay, I'm listening." Sarah opened the envelope and pulled out several old photographs and handwritten documents. "These are copies of papers and pictures that have been in my family for over 100 years. Some of them were hidden, some were passed down in secret. My grandmother made me promise that someday I would find someone from the Mackenzie family and tell them the truth." She handed Tom a faded photograph, showing a group of Apache people standing in front of a large ranch house. "This is the Riverside Ranch in 1887. Do you recognize the house?" Tom studied the photograph carefully. The house in the picture was definitely his family's ranch house, though it looked different without the additions and modifications that had been made over the decades. "Yes, that's definitely our place. But it looks different somehow." "It should look different," Sarah said quietly. "When this picture was taken, your ranch wasn't just a cattle operation. It was something else entirely." Tom looked more closely at the Apache people in the photograph. There were men, women, and children, all dressed in a mixture of traditional native clothing and Western-style work clothes. Something about their postures and expressions troubled him, though he couldn't quite identify what it was. "My great-great-grandmother is in this picture," Sarah continued, pointing to a young woman standing at the edge of the group. "Her name was Maria Crowfeather. She was 16 years old when this photograph was taken. Was she a worker on the ranch? Tom asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment before answering. In a way, yes, but not the kind of worker you're thinking of. She pulled out another document, this one covered in faded handwriting. This is a bill of sale, Mr. Mackenzie, dated August 15, 1887. It shows a transaction between your great-great-grandfather, James Mackenzie, and a man named William Porter. Tom took the document and squinted at the old handwriting. He could make out some of the words, but the faded ink and ornate script made it difficult to read. What does it say? It says that James Mackenzie purchased 3 Apache individuals from William Porter for the sum of $200. 1 adult male, age approximately 25. 1 adult female, age approximately 30. 1 female child, age approximately 10. The words hit Tom like a physical blow. He stared at the document, reading and rereading the visible portions. This can't be right. This says, it sounds like slavery, Sarah finished for him, because that's exactly what it was. Tom stood up abruptly, pacing a few steps away before turning back. But slavery was illegal by 1887. The Civil War ended in 1865. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery for African Americans, Sarah explained patiently. But Native Americans weren't considered citizens until 1924. We existed in a legal gray area where different rules applied. In many Western territories, Native Americans could be bought, sold, and held against their will under various legal pretenses. Sarah pulled out more documents from her envelope. Your great-great-grandfather wasn't the only rancher in this area who participated in this system. There are records of Apache people being sold as indentured servants or apprentices throughout Arizona and New Mexico in the 1870s and 1880s. Tom sat back down, his hands shaking slightly as he held the bill of sale. My family, we always heard stories about how my great-great-grandfather was a pioneer, how he built this ranch from nothing with hard work and determination. He did build the ranch, Sarah acknowledged, but he built it using forced labor from Apache people who had been captured during raids or purchased from traders. People who had no choice, no wages, and no freedom to leave. The desert evening was growing cooler, but Tom felt hot and nauseous. How do you know all this? How can you be sure these documents are real? Sarah had been expecting this question. Because the stories were passed down in my family, and because some of the people in that photograph lived long enough to tell their children what happened. My great-great-grandmother Maria lived until 1943. She told my great-grandmother everything, and the stories were passed down to my grandmother, then to my mother, and finally to me. She pulled out another photograph, this one showing an elderly Apache woman sitting in a wooden chair. This is Maria in 1940, 3 years before she died. She was in her 70s by then, but she still remembered every detail of her time at the Riverside Ranch. Tom studied the photograph of the elderly woman. Her face was deeply lined, but her eyes were alert and intelligent. What did she say happened here? She said that she and the others were forced to work from sunrise to sunset. The men worked with the cattle and built fences and buildings. The women cooked, cleaned, and took care of the household. The children did whatever tasks they were big enough to handle. Sarah paused, looking out at the desert landscape that stretched beyond the ranch buildings. But Maria also said that James Mackenzie wasn't the cruelest master she had heard about. He made sure they had enough food and basic shelter. He didn't beat them regularly like some of the other ranchers did to their native workers. That's supposed to make me feel better? Tom asked bitterly. No, Sarah replied firmly. There's no way to make any of this better. I'm just telling you what Maria remembered, the whole truth as she experienced it. Tom was quiet for several minutes, staring at the documents spread across his lap. Finally, he looked up at Sarah. Why are you telling me this now? Why didn't someone from your family contact my father or grandfather? Because for most of the 20th century, it was dangerous for Native Americans to talk openly about these experiences. We could lose our jobs, our homes, even our children if we were seen as troublemakers. It was safer to keep the stories within our own families. Sarah gathered the photographs and documents back into her envelope. But things have changed. There's more awareness now about the history of forced labor and cultural destruction that Native Americans experienced. I felt like it was time for the truth to come out, especially since your family is selling the ranch. Tom rubbed his forehead, feeling overwhelmed by everything he had learned. I don't know what to say. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this information. You don't have to do anything, Sarah said gently. I just wanted you to know the truth about your family's history. I wanted someone from the Mackenzie family to acknowledge what happened to my people on this land. The sun had completely set now, and the desert air was growing cold. Tom looked at the ranch house where his family had lived for 4 generations, seeing it in a completely different light. Is there more? More that I should know? Sarah nodded slowly. There's much more, but I think that's enough for tonight. You need time to process what I've already told you. As they stood up to leave, Tom turned to Sarah one more time. Will you come back tomorrow? Will you tell me the rest of the story? If you want to hear it, Sarah replied. But I should warn you, some of what I still need to tell you is going to be even harder to hear than what you learned tonight. Tom Mackenzie didn't sleep that night. He sat in his kitchen until dawn, staring at photocopies of the documents Sarah had shown him. The bill of sale lay on the table like an accusation, the faded handwriting seeming to grow darker as he read it over and over again. His great-great-grandfather's signature was clear at the bottom. James Mackenzie, August 15, 1887. When Sarah arrived the next morning, she found Tom sitting on the front porch of the ranch house, coffee cup in his hands, looking like he had aged 10 years overnight. I kept hoping I would wake up and find out this was all a nightmare, he said as Sarah approached. I wish I could tell you it was, Sarah replied, settling into the chair beside him. But the nightmare was real for my ancestors, and the truth doesn't go away just because it's painful. Tom set down his coffee cup and turned to face her. I need to know everything. Every detail you can tell me. I've been thinking all night about how my family built their reputation in this community. And I realize I don't know anything about the real foundation it was built on. Sarah opened her envelope again, this time pulling out a leather-bound journal. This belonged to my great-great-grandmother Maria. She learned to write English during her time at the ranch, and she kept a secret diary of her experiences. She hid it so well that your family never found it. Tom stared at the journal with a mixture of fascination and dread. She wrote about what happened here. Everything that happened here. The daily routines, the working conditions, the punishments, the attempts to escape. But also the relationships between the Apache people who were forced to work together. Their efforts to maintain their culture and language in secret. Sarah opened the journal to a page marked with a piece of cloth. May 12, 1889. Maria was 18 by this time, and she had been at the ranch for almost 2 years. Listen to what she wrote. The master's son came home from school today. He is maybe 20 years old. He looks at the Apache women in a way that makes us afraid. Old woman Spider said we should never be alone when he is around. Tom's stomach clenched. The master's son would have been my great-grandfather, Robert Mackenzie. Yes. Maria wrote about him many times in the following months. According to her entries, Robert Mackenzie felt entitled to the Apache women who worked on the ranch. He saw them as property that belonged to his family. Sarah turned several pages in the journal. Here's an entry from September 1889. They took Standing Bear away today. He tried to protect his daughter when the young master wouldn't leave her alone. They tied him to the fence post and whipped him until he couldn't stand. Then they loaded him in a wagon and drove him away. We never saw him again. Tom stood up abruptly and walked to the edge of the porch. Jesus Christ. They sold him? For trying to protect his own daughter? That's what Maria believed happened. There are several entries about Apache men who disappeared after causing trouble. Your great-grandfather Robert apparently had connections with mining companies and other ranches that were always looking for native workers. Sarah continued reading from the journal. October 15, 1889. Yellowbird is with child. She is only 15 years old. She cries every night because she knows the baby will be born a slave like us. The master's wife pretends not to see what her son has done, but she knows. We all know. Tom leaned against the porch railing, his knuckles white as he gripped the wood. This Yellowbird, what happened to her? According to Maria's journal, Yellowbird died in childbirth. The baby survived, but... Sarah paused, looking at Tom carefully. The baby was mixed race, Apache and white. Maria wrote that your great-grandmother took the child and raised it as part of the Mackenzie family. What are you saying? I'm saying that some of the Mackenzie family tree might include Apache ancestry that was never acknowledged. Children born from forced relationships between your male relatives and Apache women who had no power to say no. Tom sat down heavily in his chair, How many children? Sarah flipped through more pages of the journal. Maria mentions at least 3 babies born to Apache women during her time at the ranch. All of them were taken by the Mackenzie family and raised as white children. Their Apache mothers were forbidden from acknowledging them or having any contact with them. The morning sun was getting warmer, but Tom felt cold all over. Did any of these children survive to adulthood? According to oral histories in my family, at least one did. A boy who was born in 1890 and raised by James and his wife as their adopted son. They named him Thomas Mackenzie. Tom went completely still. Thomas Mackenzie was my great-uncle, my grandfather's brother, which would make him the son of an Apache woman and your great-grandfather Robert, Sarah said quietly, which would make you part Apache, Mr. Mackenzie. The silence stretched between them as Tom processed this revelation. Finally, he spoke. Do you know which woman? Which Apache woman was his mother? Sarah turned to the back of the journal, where Maria had drawn a simple family tree showing the relationships between the Apache people at the ranch. Her name was Singing Wolf. She was 17 when the baby was born. Maria wrote that Singing Wolf tried to kill herself twice after they took her son away, but the other women stopped her both times. Tom studied the family tree, seeing names and relationships that represented real people who had lived and suffered on his family's land. What happened to Singing Wolf? She lived until 1923. She married an Apache man after they were all finally freed, and she had other children. But Maria wrote that Singing Wolf never stopped grieving for the son who was taken from her. She would stand at the edge of the reservation and look toward the Mackenzie ranch, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Sarah reached into her envelope one more time and pulled out a small photograph. This is Singing Wolf in 1920, when she was about 47 years old. She's holding her youngest daughter, my great-grandmother. Tom took the photograph with trembling hands. The woman in the picture had strong, intelligent features and sad eyes. She was clearly Native American, but Tom could see something familiar in the shape of her face, something that reminded him of old family photographs he had seen of his great-uncle Thomas. This woman, Singing Wolf, she was my great-great-grandmother? If Thomas Mackenzie was indeed her son, then yes, which would make her your great-great-grandmother and make you 1/8 Apache. Tom stared at the photograph for a long time. Did she ever learn what happened to her son? Did she ever find out that he grew up to be a respected member of the Mackenzie family? Sarah shook her head sadly. According to my great-grandmother's stories, Singing Wolf died never knowing if her son was alive or dead. The Mackenzie family made sure there was no contact between the Apache community and any of the mixed-race children they raised. But surely Thomas must have known something about his origins. Maybe. But if he did, he kept it secret his entire life. By the time he was an adult, being identified as part Native American could have destroyed his social standing and economic opportunities. It was safer for him to maintain the fiction that he was a fully white adopted child. Tom set the photograph on the table and rubbed his eyes. So my great-uncle Thomas lived his entire life denying his Apache heritage. He probably never acknowledged his birth mother or tried to connect with his Apache relatives. That was the system, Sarah explained. Take the children away from their native parents, raise them in white households, and make sure they never learn about their true heritage. It was a form of cultural genocide that was practiced throughout the American West. Tom looked out at the desert landscape that surrounded the ranch, seeing it through completely different eyes. And all of this was happening right here, on my family's land, with my ancestors' knowledge and participation. Yes. But Tom, you need to understand something important. Your family wasn't uniquely evil. This system of forced labor and cultural destruction was widespread throughout the Southwest. Hundreds of ranchers, miners, and other business owners participated in buying and selling Native American workers. That doesn't make it better. No, it doesn't. But it means that what happened here was part of a larger pattern of injustice, not just the actions of a few particularly cruel individuals. Tom picked up Maria's journal and turned through several pages, seeing the careful handwriting that documented years of suffering and survival. Is there more? Are there other family secrets I should know about? Sarah nodded. There's much more. But before I continue, I need to ask you something. What are you planning to do with this information? How do you want to handle learning these truths about your family? Tom was quiet for a long time, looking out at the ranch buildings where his Apache ancestors had lived and worked as slaves. I don't know yet, but I know I can't pretend I never learned any of this. The question is, what can I do now to make any difference? That's something we'll need to figure out together, Sarah replied. But first, there's still more of the story you need to hear. 3 days had passed since Sarah first showed Tom the documents about his family's involvement in Apache slavery. They had met each morning on the ranch porch, with Sarah carefully revealing more pieces of the historical puzzle. Tom had called in sick to his construction job, unable to concentrate on anything except the devastating truths he was learning about his heritage. On the fourth morning, Sarah arrived carrying a different kind of evidence. Instead of documents and photographs, she brought a small wooden box that looked very old. This box belonged to Maria, Sarah explained as they settled into their usual chairs. She kept it hidden for her entire life, and it was passed down through my family along with her journal. Tom looked at the box with curiosity and apprehension. Over the past few days, each new revelation had been more difficult to process than the last. What's in it? Sarah opened the box carefully, revealing several small objects wrapped in faded cloth. These are things that Maria managed to save from her life before the ranch. Things that connected her to her Apache identity and her family. She unwrapped the first item, revealing a small turquoise pendant on a leather cord. This was given to Maria by her grandmother when she was 12 years old, 2 years before she was captured and sold to your great-great-grandfather. It was made by her great-grandfather and was supposed to protect her from evil spirits. Tom examined the pendant, noting the intricate silver work that surrounded the turquoise stone. She was able to keep this hidden for all those years at the ranch? Apache women became very skilled at hiding their cultural items. They knew that if the Mackenzie family found anything that connected them to their native identity, it would be taken away and destroyed. Sarah unwrapped a second item, this one a small bone carving of a bird. This was made by Maria's father. He was a skilled craftsman who was killed during the raid when Maria was captured. She managed to grab this carving as she was being taken away. Raid? Tom asked. I thought you said she was sold to my great-great-grandfather. She was sold to him, but first she was captured during a military raid on her Apache camp. This was 1885 during the final phase of the Apache Wars. The U.S. Army was trying to force all Apache people onto reservations, and there was a bounty system for capturing Apache individuals who were still living free. Sarah pulled out another document from her envelope. This is a military report from Fort Apache, dated July 20th, 1885. It describes a raid on an Apache camp near the Salt River. According to this report, 17 Apache people were killed and 8 were captured alive, 5 adults and 3 children. Tom read through the military report, struggling with the formal language and abbreviations. This says the captured individuals were turned over to civilian contractors for placement in appropriate work situations. That was the euphemism they used for selling Apache people to ranchers and business owners. The military would conduct the raids and capture people, then civilian contractors would arrange the sales. It was a profitable business for everyone involved except the Apache families who were destroyed. Sarah unwrapped the largest item in the box, revealing a small woven basket about the size of a coffee cup. This basket was woven by Maria's mother. According to Apache tradition, a woman's first basket is supposed to stay in her family and be passed down to her daughters and granddaughters. Tom handled the basket carefully, noting the intricate patterns woven into the fibers. Did Maria ever have daughters to pass this down to? Sarah's expression became even more somber. Yes, she had 3 daughters, but none of them were raised as Apache children. What do you mean? I mean that Maria was forced to have children by your great-grandfather Robert, just like the other Apache women at the ranch. But unlike the sons who were sometimes raised by the Mackenzie family as adopted white children, the daughters were usually sold to other families when they were young. Tom felt the familiar sick feeling in his stomach that had become constant over the past few days. Sold? They sold the children? Mixed-race girls were considered valuable as domestic workers. Families in Phoenix and Tucson would pay good money for young girls who could be trained as housemaids and who would never have any legal protections or rights. Sarah opened Maria's journal to a section near the middle. Here's an entry from March 1892. They took my baby daughter today. She was only 2 years old. The woman from Phoenix said she needed a girl who could be trained properly from a young age. I begged them to let me keep her, but the master's wife said I should be grateful that my child will have opportunities I never had. Tom stood up and walked to the edge of the porch again, a habit he had developed when the information became too overwhelming to process while sitting still. How many daughters did Maria have? 3 girls born between 1890 and 1895. All of them were taken away before their 3rd birthdays. Maria never saw any of them again, and she wrote about all of this in her journal, every detail she could remember. She said she wanted there to be a record of what happened, even if no one would believe it for 100 years. Sarah turned to another page in the journal. April 10, 1893. I try to remember my daughter's faces, but they change so quickly when they are small. Little Hawk was walking and starting to say words when they took her. I wonder if she will remember that she had a mother who loved her, or if they will tell her that she was always an orphan. Tom leaned against the porch railing, staring out at the desert. Do you know what happened to any of these girls? Do you know if they survived? My family has some oral history about one of them. The oldest daughter, who Maria called Little Hawk, was sold to a family named Peterson in Phoenix. According to stories that were passed down, Little Hawk grew up as a servant in the Peterson household and was never allowed to marry or have children of her own. But she survived. She lived until 1954. She died as an old woman, still working as a housekeeper for the same family that had bought her as a child. She never learned her Apache name or anything about her culture. She lived her entire life as Mary Peterson, believing she was an orphan who owed everything to the family that had saved her. Tom turned back to Sarah. Did she ever learn the truth about her mother? Sarah shook her head. Not as far as we know. The Peterson family made sure she had no contact with any Apache people, and Maria was never able to find out what happened to her after she was sold. Tom sat back down and picked up the small woven basket that had belonged to Maria's mother. So this basket, which was supposed to be passed down through generations of Apache women, ended up being hidden in a box because Maria's daughters were all taken away and raised in white households. That's exactly right. Maria kept it as a connection to her own mother, and as a hope that someday she might be reunited with her daughters. But that reunion never happened. Sarah reached into the box and pulled out the final item, a small piece of pottery with Apache designs painted on it. This piece was made by Maria herself during her time at the ranch. She made it in secret, using clay from the creek behind the barn and plant dyes she made from desert flowers. Tom examined the pottery fragment, noting the geometric patterns that were distinctly different from anything he had seen in Anglo-American crafts. How did she manage to make this without anyone noticing? Apache women were incredibly resourceful about maintaining their cultural practices in secret. They would work on crafts during their few free moments, usually late at night or early in the morning when the Mackenzie family was asleep. Sarah opened the journal to one of the final entries. December 31st, 1895. This is my 11th year at the ranch. I'm 24 years old, but I feel like an old woman. 3 of my children have been taken from me. The man who calls himself my master has used my body whenever he wanted. I have watched friends die and disappear, but I am still alive and I still remember who I am. I'm Maria Crow Feather, daughter of Swift Eagle and woman who sings to horses. I am Apache, and no amount of slavery can change that. Tom was quiet for several minutes, processing everything he had learned. Finally, he looked up at Sarah. What happened to Maria? How did she finally gain her freedom? That's a complicated story, Sarah replied. The system of Apache slavery didn't end with a single law or court decision. It faded away gradually as federal oversight increased and as it became more difficult to hide what was happening. Sarah turned to the final section of Maria's journal. The last entry is from June 15, 1898. A man from the government came to the ranch today. He said he was investigating reports of Apache people being held against their will. The master told him we were all voluntary workers, and he made us stand in a line and say we were happy to be here. But I could see in the government man's eyes that he knew we were lying. Tom leaned forward in his chair. Did this government investigation lead to Maria's freedom? Not immediately, but it was the beginning of the end. Over the next 2 years, there were more government visits, more questions, and more pressure on ranchers like your great-great-grandfather to prove that their native workers were there voluntarily. Sarah showed Tom another document from her envelope. This is a letter from James Mackenzie to a lawyer in Phoenix dated September 1899. He's asking for legal advice about how to transition his Apache workforce to a voluntary employment model without facing criminal charges. Tom read through the letter. noting his ancestors' careful language that avoided explicitly admitting to slavery, while clearly indicating that the current situation was legally problematic. So he was trying to cover his tracks. Exactly. By 1900, it had become too dangerous to continue holding Apache people as slaves, but James Mackenzie found a way to maintain control over most of his workers even after officially freeing them. How? Sarah pulled out Maria's final journal entry. July 4th, 1900. The master called us all together today and said we were free to leave. But then he explained the conditions of our freedom. Anyone who stays will receive wages of $5 per month, plus food and housing. Anyone who leaves will be reported to the authorities as a thief, since we supposedly owe the ranch money for food and shelter we received over the years. Tom shook his head in disgust. So even when he freed them, he made sure they couldn't actually leave. Most of the Apache people stayed, including Maria. They had nowhere else to go, no money, and no way to reconnect with their scattered families. The reservation system made it nearly impossible for them to return to traditional Apache life. Sarah closed the journal and returned it to the wooden box along with Maria's treasured possessions. Maria worked as a paid employee at the Riverside Ranch until 1910, when she finally saved enough money to leave. She was 39 years old when she gained true freedom. Where did she go? To the San Carlos Reservation, where she eventually married a man named Joseph Winters and had 2 more children. But she never forgot the children who had been taken from her, and she never stopped hoping that someday they might find their way back to their Apache family. Tom stared at the wooden box, thinking about the woman who had hidden these precious items for decades while enduring unimaginable hardships on his family's ranch. Did any of her children ever come back? Did she ever see them again? Sarah's expression was sad but not entirely hopeless. One of her sons did find her eventually. The boy who had been raised by the Mackenzie family as Thomas Mackenzie. Your great-uncle. Tom's eyes widened. Thomas found his birth mother? In 1925, when Thomas was 35 years old and Maria was 54. According to family stories, Thomas had always felt that something was missing from his life. He had questions about his adoption that his Mackenzie family couldn't or wouldn't answer. Sarah pulled out one final photograph, this one showing a middle-aged Apache woman standing next to a well-dressed white man. This is Maria and Thomas in 1925, the year they were reunited. My great-grandmother took this photograph. Tom studied the picture carefully. The man in the photograph had the Mackenzie family features that Tom recognized from old family pictures. But there was something else in his face, something that reminded Tom of the Apache people in the earlier photographs Sarah had shown him. How did Thomas find her? He hired a private investigator in Phoenix to research his origins. It took the investigator 2 years, but he eventually traced Thomas back to Maria and to the circumstances of his birth at the Riverside Ranch. What happened when they met? Sarah smiled for the first time since their conversations had begun. According to my great-grandmother, who was present when they met, Thomas broke down and cried like a child. Maria had always known she would recognize her son if she saw him again, and she did. She said he had the same eyes as his Apache grandfather. Did they maintain a relationship after that? They met secretly several times over the next few years. Thomas would drive out to the reservation and spend time with Maria, learning about Apache culture and his heritage. But he had to be very careful. If the white community in Cedar Ridge had learned that Thomas Mackenzie was part Apache, it would have destroyed his reputation and his business interests. Tom thought about his great-uncle, trying to reconcile the man he had heard family stories about with this new information. Did Thomas ever acknowledge his Apache heritage publicly? No, never. But he did something that was perhaps more meaningful. In 1930, he established a trust fund that provided educational scholarships for Apache children. He funded it anonymously, but Maria knew it was his way of giving back to the Apache community. The scholarship fund, does it still exist? Sarah nodded. It's administered through the Tribal Education Office at San Carlos. Over the past 90 years, it's helped hundreds of Apache students attend college. Most of them never knew that the funding came from a Mackenzie family member who was secretly part Apache himself. Tom leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by this latest revelation. So some good did come out of all this tragedy. Some good, yes, but it doesn't erase the harm that was done or bring back the lives that were destroyed. Maria lived to be 72 years old, but she died never knowing what happened to her 3 daughters. The forced separation of Apache families caused wounds that lasted for generations. The morning sun was getting higher, and Tom realized they had been talking for over 3 hours. "Sarah, why are you telling me all of this? What do you want me to do with this information?" Sarah carefully packed Maria's possessions back into the wooden box. "I want you to understand that your family's wealth and status were built on the suffering of Apache people. I want you to know that you have Apache relatives you've never acknowledged. And I want you to decide what you're going to do about it." Tom looked out at the ranch that his family was being forced to sell, seeing it now as a place where terrible injustices had been committed. "What would you like me to do? That's not for me to decide. But I will say this. The Apache community has never received any acknowledgement or apology from the Mackenzie family for what happened here. The descendants of the people who were enslaved on this ranch are still living on the reservation, still dealing with the generational trauma that was inflicted on their families." Tom nodded slowly. "And some of those descendants are my own relatives. Yes, you have Apache cousins you've never met. Tom, people who share your blood but grew up in poverty on the reservation, while your family lived in prosperity built on their ancestors' forced labor." As Sarah prepared to leave, she handed Tom a piece of paper with a phone number written on it. "This is my number. When you've had time to think about everything I've told you, call me. There are some people I think you should meet." 2 weeks passed before Tom Mackenzie found the courage to call Sarah Winters. The phone number had sat on his kitchen table like an accusation, reminding him daily of the conversation he knew he needed to have but wasn't ready for. During those 2 weeks, he had done his own research, visiting the library in Phoenix and spending hours reading about Apache history, the reservation system, and the documented cases of Native American slavery in the Southwest. What he learned confirmed everything Sarah had told him and revealed additional horrors he hadn't been prepared for. The systematic destruction of Apache families hadn't been limited to his ranch. It had been a widespread practice, supported by territorial governments and federal policies that treated Native Americans as less than human. When he finally called Sarah, his voice was quiet and uncertain. "Sarah, this is Tom Mackenzie. I've been thinking about everything you told me, and I need to know what comes next." Sarah's voice was patient, as if she had been expecting his call. "What comes next depends on what you want to happen next, Tom. But I'm glad you called. You mentioned that there are people I should meet. My Apache relatives?" "Yes, but before we arrange any meetings, you need to understand that this won't be easy for anyone involved. Many Apache families have complicated feelings about descendants of the families who enslaved their ancestors." Tom had been thinking about this exact issue for the past 2 weeks. "I understand. I can't expect them to welcome me with open arms. I represent the family that caused terrible harm to their people." "It's more complex than that," Sarah explained. "You also represent family connections that were stolen from them. Some of your Apache relatives have been wondering for decades about the Mackenzie family members who were part Apache, but never acknowledged their heritage." 3 days later, Tom drove to the San Carlos Apache Reservation for the first time in his life. The reservation was only 2 hours from his ranch, but it might as well have been on another planet for all the contact his family had maintained with it over the decades. Sarah met him at the tribal headquarters building and led him to a community center where several people were waiting. Tom's nervousness increased as they approached the building. He had no idea what to expect from this meeting or how he should behave. The first person Sarah introduced him to was an elderly man named Robert Crow Feather, who was 78 years old and walked with a cane carved from desert wood. "Robert is Maria's great-nephew," Sarah explained. "His grandfather was Maria's younger brother, who was also captured in the same raid that took Maria to your ranch." Robert studied Tom's face carefully before speaking. "You have the Mackenzie look," he said finally. "But there's something else there too. Something that reminds me of the old photographs of my great-aunt Maria." Tom didn't know how to respond to this observation. "I'm honored to meet you, Mr. Crowfeather. Sarah has told me so much about Maria and what she endured on my family's ranch." "She was a strong woman," Robert replied. "She survived things that would have killed most people. But she never forgot where she came from or who her people were." Sarah led Tom to a table where a middle-aged woman was arranging old photographs and documents. "Tom, this is Linda Singing Wolf. She's the great-granddaughter of the woman who was your great-great-grandmother." Tom felt his heart racing as he realized he was meeting a direct relative he had never known existed. Linda looked up from the photographs and studied his face with intense curiosity. "So you're the one," she said finally. "The Mackenzie who wants to know about his Apache family." "Yes, ma'am. I'm still trying to understand all of this myself." Linda picked up one of the photographs and handed it to Tom. "This is your great-great-grandmother Singing Wolf in 1920, holding my grandmother. Your great-uncle Thomas was her first child, but after he was taken away she had 5 more children with her Apache husband." Tom studied the photograph, seeing the same strong features he had noticed before. "So I have Apache relatives through this branch of the family?" "You have dozens of Apache relatives," Linda replied. "Cousins, second cousins, third cousins. Most of them don't even know you exist." An older woman sitting nearby spoke up. "I'm Margaret Standing Bear. My great-grandfather was sold to a ranch near Tucson around the same time Maria was brought to your family's place." Tom turned to Margaret, realizing that the network of Apache families affected by slavery was much larger than he had understood. "Was your great-grandfather ever freed?" "He died at that ranch in 1903, Margaret replied matter-of-factly. "Worked to death, according to family stories. Never saw his wife or children again after he was sold." The weight of these family stories was overwhelming. Tom looked around the room at the faces of people whose ancestors had suffered because of systems that his family had participated in and profited from. Sarah gestured for Tom to sit down at the table with the others. "Tom, these families have agreed to meet with you because they want you to understand the full scope of what happened, but they also want to know what you plan to do with this knowledge." "I honestly don't know yet," Tom admitted. "I'm still processing everything I've learned. But I know I can't just go back to my normal life and pretend none of this happened." Robert Crowfeather leaned forward in his chair. "Young man, your family owes a debt to the Apache people. Not just your family specifically, but all the families who participated in enslaving our people and destroying our communities." "What kind of debt?" Tom asked. Linda Singing Wolf answered. "The debt of acknowledgement. The debt of truth-telling. The debt of making sure this history is remembered and taught so it never happens again." Margaret Standing Bear added, "The debt of sharing the wealth that was built on Apache labor. Your family prospered for generations because of the work our ancestors were forced to do without pay." Tom nodded slowly. "I understand. But I need to be honest with you, I'm not wealthy. I'm losing my family's ranch because I can't afford to keep it. I don't have the financial resources to make significant reparations." "This isn't just about money," Sarah explained, "though economic justice is part of it. This is about breaking the silence that has surrounded these crimes for over a century." A younger man who had been quiet until now spoke up. "I'm David Crowfeather, Robert's grandson. I teach Apache history at the tribal college. What we need most is for white families like yours to acknowledge what happened and help us educate people about this history." Tom looked at David with interest. "What do you mean by education?" "I mean putting up historical markers where these crimes took place. I mean including this history in school textbooks. I mean making sure that when people drive past your old ranch, they know what really happened there." Linda Singing Wolf pulled out a folder full of documents. "We've been working for years to document all the cases of Apache slavery in this region. We have evidence of over 200 Apache people who were enslaved on ranches and in mines between 1870 and 1900. She spread the documents across the table. But most white families refuse to acknowledge their ancestors' participation. They claim they never knew, or they say it was a different time with different moral standards." Tom looked through the documents, seeing lists of names, dates, and locations that represented hundreds of destroyed lives. "What would acknowledgement look like?" "What would you want me to do?" Sarah had been waiting for this question. "We want you to work with us to create a memorial at your old ranch site. We want you to help us establish an educational program that tells the truth about Apache slavery. And we want you to use your position as a member of a prominent local family to encourage other families to examine their own histories." Robert Crowfeather reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather pouch. "This contains soil from the place where my great-uncle is buried. He died on a ranch near Globe in 1889, worked to death like so many others." He handed the pouch to Tom. "If you're serious about making amends, you'll carry this with you as a reminder of what your family's prosperity cost our people." Tom accepted the pouch with trembling hands, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with it. "I'll carry it, and I'll do whatever I can to help tell this story." Margaret Standing Bear looked at Tom skeptically. It's easy to make promises when you're feeling guilty and overwhelmed. But this work is going to be hard and it's going to last for years. Are you prepared for the backlash you'll face from your own community when they learn what you're doing? Tom thought about the friends and neighbors who had always respected his family name, who had attended the estate auction and offered him sympathy for his financial difficulties. I don't know how they'll react, but I know I can't live with staying silent about this. David Crowfeather pulled out a business card and handed it to Tom. Call me next week. We'll start working on a plan for the memorial and the educational program, but I want you to understand something. Once you commit to this, there's no going back. You'll be publicly acknowledging that your family participated in enslaving Apache people. Tom looked around the room at the faces of his newly discovered Apache relatives, people who had lived their entire lives with the knowledge of historical trauma that he was just beginning to understand. I'm ready to commit, he said finally. These stories need to be told and I need to take responsibility for my family's role in what happened. As the meeting concluded, Linda Singing Wolf approached Tom with one final item. This is a photograph of your great-uncle Thomas with Maria in 1930, 5 years after they were reunited. I want you to have it. Tom studied the photograph, seeing a man who looked remarkably like his own father standing next to an elderly Apache woman with kind but weary eyes. Thank you, Tom said quietly. I'll treasure this. Don't treasure it, Linda replied firmly. Use it. Use it to help other people understand that Apache and white families were connected in ways that were hidden for too long. Use it to help heal some of the damage that was done. 6 months after Tom's first meeting with his Apache relatives, the backlash Margaret Standing Bear had warned him about arrived with full force. Word had spread through Cedar Ridge that Tom Mackenzie was working with the San Carlos Apache Reservation to create what some people called anti-American propaganda about his own family's history. The trouble started when Tom submitted a proposal to the County Historical Society to install a memorial marker at the site of the old Riverside Ranch. The proposal included detailed documentation of the Apache slavery that had occurred there, along with plans for an educational display that would tell the stories of Maria Crow, Feather, and the other Apache people who had been forced to work on Mackenzie land. The Historical Society's board meeting where Tom presented his proposal was packed with longtime Cedar Ridge residents, many of whom had known the Mackenzie family for decades. Tom's hands shook as he stood before the hostile crowd, holding the folder of documents and photographs that Sarah had given him months earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, Tom began, his voice barely steady, I'm here tonight to ask for your support in acknowledging a difficult chapter in our community's history. Before he could continue, a man in the front row stood up. Tom recognized him as Bill Harrison, whose family had owned a large ranch adjacent to the Mackenzie property for 3 generations. Tom, I knew your daddy and your granddaddy, and they were good men, Harrison said loudly. This Apache woman has filled your head with lies and anti-white hatred, and now you want to put up some kind of monument to make our whole community look bad. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Tom looked out at faces he had known his entire life, people who had been neighbors, customers, and friends. Now they were looking at him with suspicion and anger. These aren't lies, Mr. Harrison, Tom replied, trying to keep his voice calm. I have documented evidence, including bills of sale and military records, that prove Apache people were enslaved on ranches throughout this area in the 1880s and 1890s, an elderly woman near the back of the room called out. Even if some of that did happen, it was over 100 years ago. Why are you trying to drag up old grievances that nobody alive today is responsible for? Tom had been preparing for this question for months. Because the effects of those crimes are still with us today. Apache families are still dealing with generational trauma from having their ancestors enslaved and their children stolen, and white families like mine are still benefiting from wealth that was built on forced labor. The room erupted in angry voices. Tom heard fragments of multiple conversations. Reverse racism, guilt manipulation, destroying our heritage. The Historical Society's president, a woman named Joyce Mitchell, finally called for order. Mr. Mackenzie, the board will need time to review your proposal and the documentation you've provided. We'll vote on this matter at next month's meeting. As the crowd filed out of the meeting, Tom found himself standing alone near the podium, gathering up his papers with shaking hands. Most people had avoided making eye contact with him as they left, but a few had given him looks of open hostility. Bill Harrison approached Tom as he was packing up his materials. "Tom, I'm going to give you some free advice. Drop this whole thing before it ruins your reputation completely. Nobody wants to hear about ancient history that makes white people look bad." "It's not about making anyone look bad," Tom replied. "It's about telling the truth." "Whose truth?" Harrison demanded. "You're taking the word of Indians over your own family's reputation. Your great-great-grandfather was a pillar of this community." Tom looked Harrison in the eye. "My great-great-grandfather owned Apache slaves. That's documented historical fact, not opinion." Harrison shook his head in disgust. "You're a disgrace to your family name, Tom. I hope you're proud of yourself." The following weeks brought a series of consequences Tom hadn't anticipated. His construction business, which had relied heavily on local contractors and referrals, began losing customers. Phone calls that used to be returned promptly now went unanswered. Job sites where he had worked for years suddenly found other contractors. The financial pressure was intense, but the personal isolation was worse. Tom found himself eating lunch alone at the diner, where he had been greeting neighbors for years. Former friends crossed the street to avoid having to acknowledge him. His mailbox began filling with anonymous letters, most of them filled with racial slurs and threats. One evening, as Tom sat in his empty house reading through hate mail, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Sarah Winter's number. "Tom, I heard about the Historical Society meeting," Sarah said without preamble. "Are you okay?" Tom laughed bitterly. "I'm broke, unemployed, and apparently the most hated man in Cedar Ridge. Other than that, I'm fantastic. I'm sorry. I should have prepared you better for how difficult this was going to be. You warned me there would be backlash. I just didn't realize how complete it would be." Tom set down the latest threatening letter and rubbed his eyes. "Sarah, I need to ask you something honestly. Is it worth it? Is telling this story worth destroying my life?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Tom, I can't answer that question for you. But I can tell you what it has meant to Apache families to have someone from the Mackenzie family finally acknowledge what happened." "What do you mean?" "Robert Crow Feather told his great-granddaughter about you last week. She's 8 years old, and for the first time in her life, she heard a story about a white person taking responsibility for historical wrongs instead of denying them. That little girl said she wants to grow up to be a bridge builder like you." Tom felt tears forming in his eyes. "But what if I can't continue? What if the financial pressure becomes too much and I have to give up on the memorial project?" "Then you give up and you move on with your life." "But Tom, you've already done something important. You've broken the silence. Other people know the truth now, even if they don't want to accept it." 2 days after his conversation with Sarah, Tom received an unexpected phone call from a reporter at the Phoenix newspaper. Word about the memorial controversy had reached the state capitol, and the reporter wanted to interview Tom about his efforts to document Apache slavery in Arizona. Tom agreed to the interview, despite knowing it would likely increase the hostility he was facing locally. The article appeared on the front page of the Sunday edition, complete with photographs of the historical documents Sarah had shown him and quotes from Apache community members who praised Tom's courage in confronting his family's past. The article had consequences Tom hadn't expected. Within a week, he began receiving phone calls and emails from people across Arizona and other western states. Some were historians and activists who offered support and additional documentation of Native American slavery. Others were descendants of white families who wanted help researching their own ancestral involvement in similar crimes. But the most surprising contact came from an elderly man named James Peterson who lived in Phoenix. Peterson called Tom on a Tuesday evening, his voice shaky with emotion. "Mr. Mackenzie, I read the article about you in the newspaper. I think you might want to know about something that happened in my family." Tom grabbed a notepad, sensing this was going to be important. "What can you tell me, Mr. Peterson?" "My great-grandfather bought an Apache girl from your family's ranch in 1892. She was about 2 years old at the time. My family raised her as a servant, and she worked in our house until she died in 1954. Tom's hand stopped moving across the notepad. "What was her name?" "We called her Mary Peterson. But according to family documents I found after my father died, her Apache name was Little Hawk." Tom's heart began racing. Little Hawk was one of Maria's daughters, one of the children who had been sold and never seen again. "Mr. Peterson, are you still in touch with any descendants of this woman?" "That's the thing, Mr. Mackenzie. Mary never married or had children. She died alone in our family's house, working as a housekeeper until the day she passed away. But she kept a small box of items under her bed, things that looked like Indian crafts. Tom gripped the phone tighter. Do you still have those items? Yes, I do. And after reading about your efforts to return Apache artifacts to their families, I think it's time these things went back where they belong. Within a week, Tom was sitting in James Peterson's living room in Phoenix, examining the contents of a small wooden box that had belonged to Little Hawk. The items were heartbreakingly simple, a few small turquoise beads, a piece of pottery with Apache designs, and a scrap of leather with Apache symbols drawn on it in faded ink. She made these while she was living in your family's house? Tom asked. Peterson nodded sadly. She must have made them in secret. My family would never have allowed her to practice Indian customs openly. Tom carefully packed Little Hawk's possessions back into the box. Mr. Peterson, these items need to be returned to her Apache family. She was Maria Crowfeather's daughter, and Maria's descendants are still living on the San Carlos reservation. I was hoping you would say that, Peterson replied. I've felt guilty about this my whole life, knowing that my family participated in separating an Apache child from her mother. 2 weeks later, Tom stood once again in the community center at San Carlos, but this time he was accompanied by James Peterson. They had come to return Little Hawk's possessions to Linda Singing Wolf and the other descendants of Maria Crowfeather. When Linda opened the wooden box and saw the items her great-great-aunt had made in secret while enslaved in a Phoenix household, she began to cry. She never forgot, Linda whispered. Even after being taken away as a baby, she never forgot she was Apache. Robert Crowfeather examined each item carefully, noting the traditional patterns and techniques that Little Hawk had somehow learned or remembered, despite being raised in complete isolation from Apache culture. This is a miracle, he said finally. For over a century, our family has wondered what happened to Maria's children. Now we know that at least one of them kept our traditions alive, even in captivity. Sarah Winters placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. This is why the work you're doing matters so much. You're not just telling historical stories. You're reuniting families and returning sacred items to their rightful communities. Tom looked around the room at his Apache relatives, people whose acceptance of him had grown stronger despite the rejection he was facing in his own community. I want to keep doing this work, he said quietly, even if it means losing everything else. I want to help more families like Mr. Peterson's come forward and return what was stolen. David Crowfeather stood up from the table where he had been examining Little Hawk's pottery. Tom, the tribal council has been discussing your situation. We know you're facing financial difficulties because of your advocacy work. We'd like to offer you a job, Linda Singing Wolf added. The reservation needs someone to coordinate our efforts to recover Apache artifacts and document cases of historical slavery. It doesn't pay much, but it would allow you to continue this work full-time. Tom felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. You would hire me? Despite everything my family did to your people? Robert Crowfeather smiled for the first time since Tom had known him. Son, you're not responsible for what your ancestors did, but you are responsible for what you choose to do now, and you've chosen to stand with us instead of against us. As the meeting concluded and Tom prepared to drive back to Cedar Ridge, Sarah walked him to his truck. How does it feel to know you'll be working full-time to expose the crimes your own family committed? Tom thought about the question as he looked out at the desert landscape that had witnessed so much suffering and resilience. It feels like the right thing to do. Maybe the only thing I can do to begin making amends. And if your white neighbors never forgive you? Tom smiled sadly. Then I'll build a new community with my Apache family. Sometimes the only way to move forward is to choose a completely different path. 3 years had passed since Tom Mackenzie first learned the truth about his family's involvement in Apache slavery. On this warm September morning, he stood at the site of his former family ranch, watching as workers installed a large bronze memorial marker that would tell the story of Maria Crowfeather and the other Apache people who had been enslaved on this land. The memorial had taken 3 years to plan, fund, and build. The Cedar Ridge Historical Society had ultimately rejected Tom's original proposal by a vote of 8-1, but Tom had found other ways to make the memorial happen. With funding from the Tribal Council, support from state historians, and donations from families like the Petersons, who had discovered their own connections to Apache slavery, The memorial was finally becoming a reality. Sarah Winters approached Tom as he watched the installation crew work. At 65 now, she moved more slowly than when they had first met. But her eyes held the same quiet determination that had driven her to seek out Tom 3 years earlier. "How does it feel to see this happening?" she asked. Tom looked at the memorial marker, reading the words that had been carefully crafted to tell the truth without inflammatory language. On this site from 1885 to 1900, Apache people were held in forced labor by the Mackenzie family. This memorial honors Maria Crowfeather and all Apache individuals who survived slavery and cultural destruction in the American Southwest. "It feels like a beginning," Tom replied. "Not an ending, but a beginning." The memorial dedication ceremony was scheduled for the following week, and Tom knew it would be a complex event. The Apache community was planning to attend in large numbers, including many people who had never before visited the site where their ancestors had been enslaved. But the local white community remained largely opposed to the memorial, and Tom expected protests and possibly violence. Over the past 3 years, Tom's life had changed completely. His job with the tribal council had led to the documentation of over 50 additional cases of Apache slavery throughout Arizona and New Mexico. He had helped 12 white families research their histories and return Apache artifacts to tribal communities. His work had contributed to a growing national awareness of Native American slavery, a crime that had been largely hidden from American history textbooks, but the personal costs had been enormous. Tom had lost most of his friendships in Cedar Ridge, and his construction business had never recovered. He now lived in a small apartment on the reservation and had very little contact with the white community where he had grown up. His transformation from respected local rancher to Apache rights advocate had made him a controversial figure throughout Arizona. David Crowfeather joined Tom and Sarah near the memorial site. Over the past 3 years, David had become Tom's closest collaborator and had helped him navigate the complex politics of working between white and Apache communities. The tribal elder council met last night. David told them, "They've decided to perform a blessing ceremony at the memorial dedication. It will be the first time Apache spiritual leaders have held a ceremony on this land since the 1880s. Tom felt the weight of this honor. "Are you sure it's appropriate for me to be present during a sacred ceremony?" Sarah smiled. "Tom, you're family now. You've earned your place in this community through your actions, not just your Apache blood." This was still difficult for Tom to accept. Despite learning that he was 1/8 Apache through his great-uncle Thomas, Tom still felt like an outsider who was being granted privileges he hadn't earned. The guilt of his family's crimes and the benefits he had received from their wealth continued to trouble him. Robert Crowfeather, now 81 and using a wheelchair but still mentally sharp, was driven to the memorial site by his grandson. He had become Tom's most important mentor in understanding Apache culture and history. "Young man," Robert said as Tom approached his wheelchair, "I have something for you." Robert reached into a leather bag and pulled out a small turquoise pendant on a leather cord. Tom recognized it immediately. It was the pendant that had belonged to Maria Crowfeather, the one Sarah had shown him in her wooden box 3 years earlier. "This belonged to your Apache great-great-great-grandmother," Robert explained. "Sarah and I have decided that you should wear it during the dedication ceremony. It will connect you to Maria and to all the Apache ancestors who suffered on this land." Tom accepted the pendant with trembling hands, feeling the smooth turquoise and the worn leather that had survived over a century of hiding and preservation. "I'm honored, but are you certain? This pendant has such sacred meaning to your family." "You are our family now," Robert replied firmly. "Maria's blood runs in your veins, and you have chosen to honor her memory instead of hiding from it. She would want you to carry this." As Tom fastened the pendant around his neck, Linda Singing Wolf approached with a manila envelope. "Tom, we received something yesterday that I think you should see before the dedication ceremony." She pulled out a letter from the envelope. This came from a woman named Catherine Williams in New Mexico. She read about your work in a magazine article and thinks her family may have purchased Apache children from your ranch in the 1890s. Tom read through the letter, noting the careful language the woman had used to describe what she had discovered in her family's documents. She mentions 2 children, both girls, purchased in 1893 and 1895. Sarah looked at the letter over Tom's shoulder. Those dates match Maria's journal entries about when her second and third daughters were taken away. David Crowfeather studied the letter more carefully. She says she has photographs and documents she wants to share. This could be evidence of what happened to Maria's other two daughters. Tom touched the turquoise pendant around his neck, thinking about Maria Crowfeather and all the Apache people whose suffering had been denied for so long. Tomorrow he would call Catherine Williams in New Mexico and begin the process of learning about Maria's other daughters. There would be more difficult conversations, more painful revelations, and more opportunities to help families confront their histories. The work of healing historical wounds was far from over, but today had been a beginning. For the first time since 1900, Apache voices had been heard on the land where they had been silenced. The truth had finally been spoken, and Tom Mackenzie had chosen to stand with the people his family had wronged rather than defend the lies that had protected his family's reputation. As he drove toward his small apartment on the reservation, Tom realized that he had found something he hadn't expected when this journey began 3 years earlier. He had found a new family, a new purpose, and a new understanding of what it meant to take responsibility for the actions of previous generations. The scars of slavery would never fully heal, but they no longer had to remain hidden. The truth had been carved in bronze and would endure long after everyone who remembered these events had passed away. And that, Tom thought, was the beginning of real justice.